Hello and welcome back to Talking Europe. More money to reduce the number of migrants coming to the European Union, possible progress in the visa liberalisation deal with Turkey, and warnings sent to Poland over changes to its constitutional court. They're just some of the files on the top of our guests' in tray. Mr. Frans Timmermans, your first Vice President of the European Commission, a very warm welcome to the show.
Thanks
for your time. Let me start with perhaps one of the most recent. We saw that announcement this week, some 8 billion euros over the next 5 years for a deal to be put in place between the European Union and Africa to stop migrants coming from there across the EU. Firstly, where is this money coming from?
This money is coming from the reserve on the Development Fund, but it's also coming from member states who will need to contribute, and it's coming from existing funds we will be redirecting towards Africa.
So will these member states contribute? Because we saw a deal signed in Malta last December. We were hoping for member states to put up 500 million euros. I believe only 80 million has been promised. Nothing really handed out. Why believe it now?
Let's wait and see what they have to say about this, and if they have alternatives, tell us. But, you know, we need to solve this problem. Europe can't handle millions of Africans coming to Europe to work and live here. But we shouldn't continue with the present situation, people drowning in the Mediterranean. More than 2,000 people have drowned this year alone, and we need to do something about that.
Indeed, 10,000, the UN figures coming out this week, 10,000 since 2014. Now, if we get the money together, where exactly will it go? Who's going to control it? Will it be handed over to governments? Is there going to be an EU contingent on the ground?
What we're going to try and do is to replicate some of the most successful operations in the past, between Spain and Morocco, for instance, but also some of the stuff we're doing with Turkey, where we are building schools, making sure that refugees have food, that there are decent medical conditions, that there is housing. And we invest directly. We work with the local authorities, but the investment goes directly and is controlled also by the European Union. And that's the sort of thing we'd like to do in Africa as well.
And now one part of the plan, if I understand correctly, is this European blue card. It's almost like the United States green card. It's allowing for more legal migration, basically opening the door, if I understand correctly, to the educated people with university degrees.
Yes, this is for high-skilled workers. We've had this blue card for a long time, but there's no coordination between member states on this. Just to give you a figure, until now, about 14,000 people have come to Europe with a blue card, which is a very small number compared to the population of Europe. 12,000 of these people have gone to Germany. So it's, in fact, something that only works for Germany. We need to make sure it works for all European nations so that we sort of coordinate the criteria. But the nations stay in full control of this issue themselves.
And is that fair in a way to take the highly skilled workers out of their native countries in Africa? You know, if we're trying to make economies in a lot of different African countries better and improve the conditions there to stop the push factor, is it then not a bit hypocritical to say, oh, but all the best educated can come?
Well, the blue card users mostly are part of what I would call circular migration. They spend a couple of years in Europe, they spend a couple of years in India or in China, then they go back to Africa or to other places. That's the future of migration. You know, people with high skills apply these skills elsewhere, learn other skills there and then take them back home. I think for high-skilled people, this is the future of the world.
OK, well, smuggling, indeed a big issue, trying to crack down on that. It's also part of the plan when the EU looked at the other migrants, more refugees, they're coming from the direction of Turkey. A deal was signed with Turkey. Part of that deal was this visa liberalisation process. It was expected to come into place at the end of June. However, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan still saying he will not change the country's anti-terrorism laws. These anti-terrorism laws, which, you know, a lot of us in the EU suspect he's been using to crack down on journalists, government critics. Where do we stand today on that?
We're talking to the Turkish authorities about this. There can be no misunderstanding about the EU benchmarks. They need to change the laws. If they don't, we can't say that they've met the benchmark. So we're still waiting for them to take internal decisions. We're talking to them to find solutions. I have to say, Turkish authorities are very constructive about this. So if you look behind the rhetoric and behind what's said publicly, we're really in a constructive mood with them. So I hope we can solve this issue within the next couple of weeks.
Another issue brought up by members of the European Parliament this week was the immunity that the Turkish government was taking away from from MPs. Again, people worried that this is going to crack down on, perhaps the Kurdish MPs, anyone against Erdogan, really.
Well, there can be no misunderstanding. We have a serious problem with human rights and democracy and the rule of law in Turkey. The media are under incredible pressure in Turkey. So if Turkey is serious about wanting to move closer to Europe, these things will have to change. Now Turkey is moving away from Europe, and that's a tragedy. So if they really want what they say, and that is come closer to Europe, they will have to improve in human rights, they will have to improve in freedom of the media, they will have to improve in the rule of law.
And in relation to this agreement we signed, to curb the amount of refugees coming to the EU, how long do we give them to change that? When will this plan fall apart? Have we a plan B?
Well, on all the issues I mentioned, democracy, the rule of law, etc., the best possible way of getting somewhere is to open the chapters related to those issues in the enlargement negotiations, chapter 23 and 24. That would give us a platform to engage with them very precisely on freedom of the media, on the judiciary, etc., etc. In the agreement we've reached with them on the refugees, an agreement which, might I say, has led to the stop of people crossing from Turkey into Greece, has led to the end of people dying in the Aegean Sea.
But this agreement, camps somewhere else.
This agreement is successful because it has put an end to a lot of human suffering, and it has broken the back of these ruthless criminals who don't care about human life, who laugh when people drown, who just pocket the money that they extort from these poor people.
Of course, it could be, though, that it's gone out of our vision from the EU. It's moved the problem somewhere else. We're being told that even a lot of human rights organisations say Turkey is even sending people back into Syria, which is still at war, and we're not looking at the root of the problem.
Well, the war needs to end, obviously, but I've been to refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Syria. If you talk to the people there, what do they want? What do they really want? And they will all give you the same answer. We want to go home. So we need to create conditions in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, humane conditions, sound conditions, so that people can live there in a decent way, waiting to go home once the war is over. The farther they are away from Syria, the more difficult it will be for them to return.
Indeed, and the more the country gets destroyed. But is there a deadline, to see Turkey fulfil its part of the deal to actually, get things moving?
Well, the longer they wait with meeting the benchmarks, the longer it will take for the European Parliament to take up the issue and decide on it. So, the longer they wait, the longer it will take for us to be able to say we can have visa liberalisation.
Well, Turkey then still working on some of the 72, I believe, criteria. However, there's also questions now swirling around the EU rule of law and possible breaking of that by a member state. It's Poland. Since the Law and Justice Party took over power there, they've made changes to the Constitutional Court. They're appointing a lot of judges, that are believed to be closer to their line of thinking. I know the Commission sent a critical opinion, I believe it's called. What is that? Basically a warning, a complaint? It doesn't have any real force, does it?
In our dialogue, because we're in a phase of dialogue with Poland, part of the possibility in the rule of law framework we have is that during this dialogue we can write down our opinion about where the solutions of the problem might lie. And that's what we sent to the Polish authorities for their consideration. We really hope we can bring the parties closer together. This persistent conflict between the Constitutional Tribunal and the government, it should be put to an end, because the last thing we want is two parallel legal structures to be created in one of our most important member states. That gives insecurity to citizens and insecurity to investors. It's not good for Poland, for its economy, etc. So we're trying to help them to bring this to a positive solution.
And how do you feel then when you hear from the Justice Minister saying, well, the EU is just trying to interfere in Polish affairs? It's their constitutional court, it's their government. And indeed, the line of the government is they're only rebalancing the power after the civic platform, the group that were in power before, had tilted it the other way.
Well, the Polish government themselves asked for the opinion of the so-called Venice Commission, which is a commission from the Council of Europe, a sister organisation of the EU, the Council of Europe experts on human rights and the rule of law. And their opinion is crystal clear in terms of what the rules are pertaining to the rule of law and the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland. They've asked for it themselves. It would be helpful if they would take that seriously and implement the advice they've received.
Do you think they will? I mean, we hear from the party leader, he's not the Prime Minister, he's not the President, but the party leader, Jarosław Kaczynski, he's saying, oh, it's a made-up procedure. Do you think there's actually a will to change things there?
Well, we'll see. I think it's in the interest of all parties involved to close the matter, because the longer it lasts, the more difficult it will be to avoid two parallel legal systems in Poland.
And now the EU has sent the letter clarifying its position on it. What more can it do? Because we talk of this idea of putting sanctions on Poland, taking away its voting rights, but that would need the unanimous support of all member states. We've already heard from Hungary's Viktor Orban saying he would not allow that.
Well, there are different procedures that can be followed, but we're not there yet. We're in the middle of a dialogue. I hope the dialogue is productive. If it's not productive, we'll see what we'll do next. But I hope we can solve this issue without going down that road.
OK, but there are methods in place. Good
Absolutely.
to hear. Now, I'm going to move on to a word that I believe has been banned in the EU Commission. It's the word Brexit. But we're gearing up for that vote on June 23rd, when the UK will vote on its membership of the European Union. How important do you think it is that the UK, for the rest of us in the EU, how important is it if the UK stays?
Well, I think I share the opinion of a vast majority of Europeans who strongly believe that the UK should remain in the European Union. There was a recent poll done which shows clearly a vast majority of Europeans, also in France and other places, who say we want the UK to remain in the EU. We want them on board because we're stronger together. I think that's a very powerful message, and I really support that message. Now,
you're, in a way, the lawman of Europe, you know, looking at after all of that force. And one of the big questions from people in the UK is this question of sovereignty, this idea that the EU imposes a lot of rules, a lot of laws on the UK. Gives an idea how much of that is true.
Well, I mean, there's been so many facts and non-facts in this debate. You know, the only thing we're doing from the Commission is applying treaties. And the treaty is signed by the member states and ratified by sovereign parliaments. So we're doing nothing that wasn't agreed by national parliaments, by national governments. The only thing we can do is apply the law, and we can't go over that. We can't abuse that, because we would be corrected by the court immediately. So what we're doing is applying the treaty that has been agreed by all member states, including the United Kingdom, and ratified by all national parliaments, including the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Indeed, and ratified by the government both in the UK and in the Netherlands. It was ratified directly by the government, that Lisbon Treaty, because before that we had, and I believe you were one of the men that helped write what was then called the EU Integration Treaty, what became the Constitution. That was put to a vote in your native Netherlands and it was rejected. So clearly a lot of Euroscepticism there. What do you think would happen today if a similar referendum was held in the Netherlands?
Well, very difficult to say, but I think there's still, the polls show that there's still a lot of support, overwhelming support for EU membership. So if that's the question, the polls indicate that there's a lot of support for it. But I'm under no illusion. There's not much love lost for Europe these days. Europe, at best, you know, is seen as an annoyance, and at worst, is seen as an enemy. So we need to fix that, and we can only fix that if we become less. We've been over-promising and under-delivering. We need to turn that around. We need to be far more modest in what we promise, and we need to be clear on what we can deliver, because we're the only ones who can deliver. On certain issues, member states cannot do it alone. They will need the European Union to solve that, but we shouldn't promise more than we can deliver.
That's potentially part of the big problem, is that over-delivering or over-promising, as you mentioned. Finally, the Dutch are not part of the party, but we are gearing up this weekend.
Thanks for bringing it up.
First of all, what happened? Euro 2016, the Dutch not part of the party. Who are you supporting today?
Well, you know, we're not part of the party because we're simply not good enough. It's that simple in football. You know, the majority of my countrymen support the Belgians. There's even, in my place of birth, which is Maastricht, they even tried to change the border a bit so that they would be part of Belgium for the time being. So most Dutch people support the Belgians. They've got some brilliant players, the Belgians. But my guess is that the final will be between France and Germany, frankly. OK, well, we'll have to wait a few more weeks then to see. Mr. Frans Timmermans, thanks so much for your time. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.